Welcome to the Young Turks. We've got a great and awesome show for you. Now, I normally say that, but this one is particularly awesome because instead of the regular power panel, which is also terrific and will come right after the interview, we have Senator Bernie Sanders in the studio again. So, Senator Sanders, great to have you on the Young Turks.
Good to be with you again.
All right. So, first, we have to discuss politics, and obviously there is a tremendous amount of buzz around the Bernie-Trump debate, as people are calling it. Well, we've added a little bit of fuel to that fire, and we said that we would host it. Now, I know Donald keeps changing his mind every once in a while, but if he were to agree, would you do the debate right here on the Young Turks?
Well, we'd have to look at it. We would probably take a look. I have to tell you, be happy to do it here. Maybe we could simulcast it. But if ABC or CBS wants to do it, that's good too. But I think, as you indicated, Trump indicated he wanted to do it, then he didn't, then he did, then he doesn't. So we hope that he changes his mind for the 5th time in 2 days, and that he does come on board, and that he does it. And the reason I want him to do it is I really want, face-to-face, for him to explain to the American people, why he thinks giving hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to billionaire families like his own is a brilliant and constructive idea, and why he thinks it is good for America that a candidate for president should insult Mexicans and Latinos, Muslims, women, African Americans, veterans. Why? I really would love to hear the explanation why he thinks that trying to divide this country up is a good idea rather than taking pride in our diversity and bringing us together. So I would very much look forward to that debate. The other thing that I want to say is, because it's kind of complicated, and I don't understand half of it myself, is you got all this delegate count out there, right? All right, so you understand this. Well, let me explain it a little bit to the viewers, if I might. There are pledged delegates. Pledged delegates are delegates you actually win. When we win in Oregon, we win a certain number of delegates who have voted for us. And then you got super delegates. Now, super delegates are a strange animal. They are part of the Democratic establishment. They're members of Congress. They're other folks. And the main point, I think, to be made at this moment about super delegates is, Cenk, 400 of them were on board Clinton's campaign before anybody else got into the election. How's that? Does that sound pretty crazy to you?
Yeah, no, they're the establishment, so that sounds about right to me.
That's the anointment process.
That's
In other words, we all say, hey, we are beyond you. Oh, there are other people running. Well, that's irrelevant. We're going to get you the money. We're going to get you the support. Problem with that is not only is it undemocratic, what it does not take into consideration is the political reality of the moment. And the political reality of the moment, and this is the point we will make to superdelegates, is that every poll that's been out there, whether it's a national poll or a state poll, has us defeating Trump, often by big numbers. Here in California, we are ahead of him by 17 points, for example. And in almost every instance, by larger numbers than Hillary Clinton. In fact, there are some states out there where Clinton is losing to him. Pretty scary, and we are beating him. So the point that we're going to make to the superdelegates is your job is to come up with the strongest candidate, the candidate who absolutely and definitively defeat Donald Trump. And we think the evidence is pretty clear that that's Bernie Sanders.
So there's a couple of components to that. So first, on the issue of counting the superdelegates when they haven't voted yet, honestly, I was surprised that your campaign wasn't more aggressive about that from the beginning, because I think that it was a bit of a talking point put out there by the Clinton campaign that almost all the media went along with, when in reality the superdelegates switch all the time and their vote has not been counted until they actually vote.
You are absolutely right. So let me say a word on that. You're right, and we are going to pick up on that. So here is the point. As I see it, Clinton's strategy is on June 7th in New Jersey to announce that the campaign is over. She has won the requisite number of votes. By that, she means that she is including all of the superdelegates who have been pledged to her. Without the superdelegates, she does not have, by any means, through pledged delegates, the votes that she needs to secure the nomination. And you're right in saying that the media very often confuses that. The superdelegates do not vote until the convention. They have not voted yet.
Yeah, I honestly think that your campaign, if I have a criticism of it, is that you've got to be tougher on the media. So when they say the super delegates are counted, and now Chris Matthews has announced that as soon as New Jersey votes, they're all going to say that it's over when the super delegates haven't voted. I mean, the Clinton camp, if the situation was reversed, would jump all over them and say that's not factual, that's a negligent journalism, et cetera.
The answer is you're right, and we still have time to rectify that. But the main point right now that I would ask of folks who are watching the program is the real responsibility of the convention is to nominate the candidate that best reflects the issues of people who vote Democratic, in fact, the majority of the American people, and who can best beat Donald Trump. And I would hope that people stand up and make their point of view very clear on that. Now, in terms of the pledged delegates, let me say a word about that one. These are the real delegates. Right now, with 6 states and 3 non-states, D.C., the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, yet to vote, 9 entities, we are at 46%. I think we stand a very good chance in the next 9 contests to do quite well. And I think we may do very, very well here in the largest state in California. I hope, and it's an uphill climb, and I'm the first to admit it, my hope is that we can make it to 50%. If not, we'll be at 48, 49%. But what I hope delegates take into account is that we have had to compete in many states where the process was closed. That if you were an independent, New York State stands out. 3 million people could not vote in New York State because they weren't registered as a Democrat or Republican. That's pretty crazy stuff. I hope the delegates take that into consideration. That we may, if we don't get to 50, if we end up 48, 49%, what would have happened if the process was open? And here is the important point. As you well know, you got Democrats here, you got Republicans here, but more and more people are identifying themselves as independents. To exclude them from the nominating process when they're going to be voting in the general election, to me, is pretty crazy.
Now, on the other hand, Senator Sanders, you earlier made the case that superdelegates should vote with the pledged delegates. So now if you're saying, hey, wait, she's won the pledged delegates, but you guys should vote for me anyway, isn't that hypocritical?
No, it's not. I mean, it's not hypocritical in the sense that what I think is the goal of, look, you don't need a computer, you can have a calculator to just add up the number of superdelegates to the number of pledged delegates. Why does any human being have to do anything? The goal here is to look at the political reality of the moment. And the political reality of the moment is that it is most important to defeat Donald Trump, and you want the candidate leaving that convention who is going to be strongest to defeat Trump. That's all. And what we're saying is, it is absurd to my mind that Clinton has 400 superdelegate votes before the first ballot is cast. And that we have to compete in a situation in which we're up against closed primaries where a significant part of the population can't vote. We usually win independent votes, sometimes 2-1. That's the only point that I want to make. We need to have the strongest candidate against Trump. I believe that I am that candidate.
Well, in an ideal world, would you have superdelegates, or would you?
Good question. No, I don't think you would. But what we want to do, and this is part of the rules discussion that we're going to have at the convention, you want as democratic a process as possible with a small d. Is there a role for governors and senators and congresspeople? Yeah, I think there is. I don't think they should be excluded. I think they've spent their lives working at this stuff. They know something. They're important. But I think that the way the process is structured now is not sensible at all. So I can't give you the exact answer, but we have to rethink absolutely the current process.
So in my mind, there's one situation where the superdelegates could be relevant. Obviously we don't see eye to eye on everything, and this is among them. I think the pledged delegates should decide who wins the election. But the one area where the superdelegates could be relevant, in my mind, is if there is an extraordinary circumstance. For example, if the FBI has a dozen agents investigating you and then you get indicted before the convention. Now, I'm not allowed to say that. That's what the rest of the media tells me. Shh, you're not allowed to talk about it. And what's interesting is you guys don't talk about it. So I'm wondering why you don't, because I'm pretty sure that if the FBI had a dozen agents investigating you, Hillary Clinton would talk about it.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because I'm running a different type of campaign, and because I think there's profound disgust with the political process as it now stands. And what I have done my best in this campaign is not to attack Hillary Clinton on a personal level. And what I think the American people want to see is a discussion about the issues that impact their lives, okay? And the issues that impact their lives are they're working longer hours for low wages, they can't afford to send their kids to college, there is massive and grotesque levels of income inequality in this country. We got to deal with climate change, we got to deal with paid family and medical leave. We're the only major country not to have health care to all people. So what I'm trying to do in this campaign is not to say, hey, Bernie Sanders is a wonderful guy, Hillary Clinton is a terrible, flawed human being, vote for me. What I'm trying to do is create a political revolution so millions of people stand up and fight for their own families and for their own lives on those issues that are important to them. And once you get off of that stuff and you go after, Bill Clinton's personal life or, Hillary here, there are investigations underway. They will play out, all right? Believe me, they will be in the newspapers. I don't have to talk about them. So that's the reason why. And I do feel strongly about that.
So you don't talk about it, but there is a circumstance under which an indictment does happen before the convention. If it happens, do you make that case to the superdelegates?
Well, look, you don't have to make the case. Every superdelegate, these people are not dumb. I may disagree with them. They may be more conservative than me. They're not dumb. And they want, as much as anything in this world, to make certain that Donald Trump does not become president. But that gets to the issue that I mentioned a moment ago. Their job, their ultimate job is to determine who is the strongest candidate and how we defeat Trump. And certainly if, and I'm not saying it is, but there's something like that were to happen, would that impact the electorate? Of course it would. And would that be taken into consideration by the delegates? Of course it would.
So last question about the superdelegates. We have heard rumors that if there was a situation along those lines, that they would bring in Joe Biden and try to convince the superdelegates and Hillary Clinton's pledge delegates to vote for Joe Biden, or an establishment candidate like Biden. What would be your reaction?
Well, now we're speculating twofold, right? We're off in speculation world. So number one, it is that there will be an indictment, which I do not know. And number two, that if there was, Joe would be brought in. I think that would be a terrible, terrible idea. And what that would say to the millions of people who have supported us, who have worked with us, to say, all of your energy, all of your votes, all of your beliefs are irrelevant. We're going to bring in somebody else. I happen to like Joe a lot, but I think that would be a very, very serious blunder for the Democratic Party.
All right, now some Democrats are charging that you're running a scorched earth campaign now, which I find amusing given the conversation we just had.
That's right.
But some of your supporters are frustrated that the opposite is true. So, for example, in the debates, when they ask you, can you name any positions she's changed because of the donations she's gotten from Wall Street? I think that a lot of the supporters go, say the bankruptcy bill.
I did say the bankruptcy bill later on. Bankruptcy is one. But look, here again, look, Cenk, are we running a perfect campaign? Obviously not. Let me tell you, campaigns are very crazy things. Because so much is happening so quickly. You have to make 14 decisions a day. And if you make, 8 of them right, you're probably doing pretty well. We started at 3% of the polls. Now we're, relatively, we started where nobody thought we'd win one primary. We've now won 20 primaries and caucus, stand possibility of winning half the bloody states in this country. That's pretty good, So I concede that we have made our share of mistakes in how we go forward. But the point there again was to try to attack her integrity in a way that I'm not comfortable in doing. Other people may do it differently, but gets back to my point. I honestly believe the American people are saying, look, these are, and I'll tell you something else. If we don't make it, and if Clinton is the nominee, what will sadden me very much about the campaign between Clinton and Trump, both of them have very, very high unfavorable ratings. Over 50%, I think, right?
That's right. In one poll, Hillary Clinton is even losing to Donald Trump in unfavorables by 5 points.
So what you're going to see is people voting not for somebody, but very much against somebody. Mm-hmm. And that is very depressing for this country. What I want, and why I don't get into personal attacks, I want people to be voting for a vision, something they feel good about, where they want this country to go, not to be slamming, Clinton. Now, I had to make an exception with Donald Trump. And I got to tell you, I felt even a little bit uncomfortable with that. The sad reality is, forget Trump's ridiculous positions on the issue, he happens to be a pathological liar, all right? And I think even some of the media picks up on very high percentages of the things he says are just not based on fact. He saw Muslims celebrating in Jersey City, I think it was.
Yeah.
He was the only person in America to have seen that on television. Amazing thing. He has these credible eyes. It wasn't on television. And on and on and on it goes. And I called him a pathological liar. But in general, I think the American people are hungering for a real discussion of why the middle class is disappearing, why we have so many people in poverty. And that's the kind of effort that I think we got to bring forth.
Well, we just mentioned the Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, but they both have high unfavorables. First, the Democratic Party, some of the folks in the establishment will say that that's your fault. That you. So let me ask an interesting question. Who do you think is more responsible for our unfavorables, you or her?
I think maybe she will have to take some responsibility, just a little bit. And the fact is, let me review, you made the point, right? You said that many of my supporters think I have not been hard enough on her, right?
Yeah,
and we hear that quite often.
Yeah.
And believe me, Trump will be coming from a very different direction. They have 50 people doing opposition research, and everybody knows what's out there. So to say that we have been hard, we have been too hard, scorched earth, is totally absurd. The truth is, and here is, I think, the most important element of this campaign, is the American people are sick and tired of establishment politics. That's what it is. Do people really agree with Donald Trump's absurd views? No. But they see him, and he's a phony, of course, and he's a very good showman, that they perceive him to be, that's his effort, to be anti-establishment. And anybody who's anti-establishment is better than the establishment. Whatever you want to say about Hillary Clinton, you like Hillary Clinton, you don't like Hillary Clinton is the establishment. No one can deny that. In every state we go to, she touts, these are all the mayors who are supporting, these are the governor, here's the the senators. Here's the business community who's supporting. This is the establishment. She can't run away from it. Problem is the people today are not enamored with the establishment. They have contempt in many ways for the establishment, whose greed, and I'm talking about the financial institutions, Wall Street, talking about corporate America. I mean, it has become so apparent that the function of corporate America is to give their CEOs tens of millions of dollars a year in salary, send out jobs to China, cut back on health care or wages for their workers. The incredible greed that is out there. I'm afraid that these are the people in many respects who are contributing to Hillary Clinton.
Rand Paul actually had a great line that he told me in person. He said, Donald Trump is truth-telling without the truth. and so I really think that it does get to the essence of it. It's what you were just mentioning there. It gives people a sense that he's anti-establishment and telling it like it is while actually making things up, right? But given that phenomenon, given that he's now closed an 11-point lead that Hillary Clinton had in the average of polls, not just one poll, but an average of polls, and he's now tied with her, are you worried that Hillary Clinton is going to lose to Donald Trump?
Am I worried? Am I worried? Why do you think I'm going crazy? Why do you think I'm running all over the state of California, doing 3 rallies a day? We're going to have a letter going out to super-delegates, I don't know, today or tomorrow, as soon as I'm finished with it. Making that point, am I worried? I'm scared to death. Look, and people probably won't believe me. I never woke up. I'm not one of these guys. I came from a low-income family. The fact that I made it to the United States Senate is incomprehensible to many of my friends. The idea of becoming president of the United States is beyond anyone's belief. So I don't stay up nights, and I never have. Say, oh my, I was born to be president. My dad, mom took me to the country club, and they said, son, we're prepared to put $5 million into your campaign so you become president. That's not the world that I live in. We grew up in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn. But I see what Trump is. Trump is a phony. Trump is a demagogue. Trump is willing to do terrible things and say terrible things and lie in order to get the votes he needs to win. And I'm not quite sure that Hillary Clinton can effectively compete against him. Now, I'm not saying that she can't win. I think it's an excellent chance she can win. In fact, if I were a betting guy, I would say the likelihood of if it is Clinton versus Trump, I would put my money on her. But can she lose? Absolutely she can lose. And I think, as I've said, the reason I'm here, the reason I'm knocking my brains out and running all over California and trying to win the nomination is I think I am a much stronger candidate.
I will ask one personal question. The Republicans got many from Anderson Cooper, so I think I'm allowed one for you. So what do you think your parents would think if they found out that you wound up becoming the most successful Jewish politician in American history, and within, I mean, about this close to becoming president of the United States and leader of the free world?
Well, first of all, we're not giving up on this thing. We hope that they would be looking at me becoming president. It would be, to say that it would be far-fetched, that it would not be in their realm of thinking would be an understatement. Okay. They were very, very happy that I went to college. Okay, that I went to college. So the idea that their son would become a mayor, a congressman, a senator, and president of the United States, it would not be within the realm. Just would not be within the realm of possibility. That's just not a thought that would have ever crossed their mind for 1 second.
All right, let's go to policy. So if you become president of the United States and the Republicans go, you know what, Senator Sanders, you did it. You're President Sanders. You win, no mas. And we're not going to give you everything, but we'll give you one thing. Okay, one policy position. What would it be?
Doesn't work like that. The first goal of the president, I mean, I'm happy to answer that, but the first goal of the president is to change the dynamics very fundamentally of American politics. What goes on right now is you got a Washington there, and it sounds, the more I go out on the campaign trail, the more I understand how little people know or pay attention or care about what goes on in Washington, D.C. It could be up on the moon, Mars, doesn't matter. They don't pay attention. So the first thing you got to do is not just sit down with Mitch McConnell, and hopefully I think if I win, by the way, the Republicans will not control the Senate, and I think they're going to lose a lot of votes in the House as well, a lot of members in the House. First thing we got to do is revitalize American democracy before you even sit down and talk to the Republicans. Because right now, if you just talk to them, they're in an advantage because the American people are not involved in that debate and in that discussion. So I want to make public colleges and universities tuition free. Well, you know what? Millions of young people and their families say to the Republicans, guess what? There's a bill coming up in 2 weeks. You better damn well vote for that bill because I don't want my kid graduating $80,000 in debt. Can we mobilize those people? Yeah, you can. President of the United States can be not only commander-in-chief, he could be chief organizer, chief political organizer in this country. Think about the bully pulpit you have as president, what you can do. And that's what we do. Healthcare is the same issue. So the first thing you have to do, rather than talk about whether it's a Medicare for all healthcare system, whether you talk about its jobs by rebuilding our infrastructure, or paid family and medical leave, or free tuition in public colleges, it is mobilizing the American people so that when Republicans are thinking about voting, they're going to have to look out and say, holy God, we're getting bombarded with emails, with letters, with phone calls, with demonstrations. We better do the right thing. And if we don't, we're out of office. That's the most important thing a president can do.
So my question was not a process one, it was a policy one. I'm going to get back to it, though, because the process one is very important and interesting. Because a lot of the pundits on TV and, again, the Democratic Party, unfortunately, think that the right idea is if you have enough tea with the Republicans and you play enough golf with them.
That's right. That is, thank you. You hit the nail right on the head. And that is the difference between my approach. People say, what's the difference between you and Hillary Clinton? I know Mitch McConnell, I know Paul Ryan, I know these guys, and I can talk to them. But I'm not going to sit down and talk to them unless I have millions of people behind me making the case. And that's why I've said over and over again, it's not just electing a president, we need a political revolution. So it's not just, what can I do? I say, hey, Paul Ryan, what do you think? Think we should break up the banks and put a tax on Wall Street speculation so we can have free tuition in public colleges and universities? You think Ryan's got, Bernie, gee, what a great idea. Why didn't I think of that idea? Let's move on it. Get the guys writing it. It doesn't happen like that. It happens when millions of people stand up and demand that. That is the history. You've heard me say this 100 times. The trade union movement that we saw 100 years ago, civil rights movement, women's movement, gay movement, the fight for 15, that's the only way real change takes place. But think about it. This time we'll have a president who is part of that change process. That has never happened.
See, to me, that's a lot more pragmatic than saying, oh, if I just, have a beer with Paul Ryan, he'll change his mind, or you will finesse him into...
That is the stupidest, I understand. That's a lot of what these establishment guys say. And by the way, Obama is criticized because he's not afraid, he doesn't slap people on the back enough. These guys, the Republicans, are not stupid. It's not going to take a glass of wine or a beer to change their mind. They know what they're doing. They're pretty smart people. Their job is to protect the ruling class of this country. And a glass, a beer is not going to change that. The only thing that does change it is a political revolution.
Sounds a little bit more pragmatic to me. All right, so now on to the policy. Of course it doesn't work in the way that I originally said it. I'm saying, it goes from your mouth to God's ear. So you get one policy position. what would it be in an ideal world?
I think if we could guarantee health care to all people as a right, it would take an enormous load off of people's backs. You know what it would mean? It's not just, it would mean people can go to the doctor when they're sick. It'd mean you don't have to worry about these deductibles and the co-payments. And I'll tell you what else it means, which nobody talks about very much. Do you know how many millions of people in this country stay at jobs they despise because they're getting decent health insurance for their families? Millions of people. What would happen in America if we tell young people and old people, guess what? You got health insurance. You can go out and start your own business. You can start doing what you want to do and your kids will still have health insurance. I think that would free up a lot of the entrepreneurial spirit of this country, be an extraordinary boon for the economy.
Now, one of your trademarks is authenticity, right? That's why a lot of the young kids,
All right, what do I have to do to be authentic here? Jump on the table? Yeah.
No. We're not going to dance. We're not going to do anything like that. No, believe me and you dancing would not be authentic. Okay. So, but I think some of your supporters think, all right, well, if you lose, and then you say go vote for Hillary Clinton, well, is that an inauthentic position given the argument you've made against her throughout these primaries?
Well, I'm not going to speculate because we're going to do everything we can for all the reasons that we've discussed not to lose. And this is where politics becomes very sticky, you know. And that is that I believe, personally, that Trump is a pathological liar. I think he knows very little about public policy. I think he could care less. And I think he would be a horrific danger for this country. And I will do everything I can to see that he is defeated. Now, the real question, to be authentic, I have to tell you that you didn't ask the right question, Cenk.
Okay, all right, help me. Go ahead.
I'm going to help you. This is the question to you.
I'm not sure I'm going to agree. But okay, go ahead.
You know, the real question that we have to ask is, why is Secretary Clinton not connecting to so many millions of people? That's the real question. And I think, you know, the reason is because, you know, people have seen her change her views on so many issues, perceive her to be very political rather than motivated by a set of ideas. You know, does she care about children? Yes, she does. Does she care about women? Yes, she does. You know, not recently, in the course of this campaign, she came in opposition to the TPP. Do people think that really came from her heart, or was that political? She came in opposition to the Keystone Pipeline after telling us that it was a pretty good idea. People kind of believe that? Well, I'm not so sure that they do. So, you know, the real issue is Secretary Clinton able to make the case to the people that her vision for America is what their vision is, and that she, in fact, is sincerely going to stand up and fight for that vision.
So right now she says, for example, that she's against TPP. Do you believe that at all? Do you think if she's president of the United States that she would actually fight against TPP?
Well, let me quote a guy named Donahue, Tom Donahue. Dom is, you know, he's the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
That's right.
If my memory is correct, he said, don't worry about what Secretary Clinton is saying now. She'll come on board later on. You know, I think her history is, and one can't be definitive about this, you know, I don't know what's in her mind. Her history has been to support virtually every trade agreement. I think she voted against CAFTA, but she supported virtually every trade agreement that's come down the pike. I've opposed all of these trade agreements because I think they're a disaster for the American worker. So might she have seen the light? Maybe. Or is she doing it for political reasons? I think there are many who would suggest that she's doing it for political reasons.
Is it an issue that as late as 2012, Hillary Clinton still said that gay people should not have the same right to marry as straight people? So do you believe her conversion in 2013? And if you don't, what does that say about that candidate and whether you can back
Well,
it?
that's the same point that I'm trying to make. Do I think that Hillary Clinton is homophobic? No, I don't. By any stretch of the imagination. But I think they are political. Now, I had to cast the vote back in, I think it was 1996 when I was in the House. And this was not an easy vote. You know, the world has changed. A lot of young people don't know that. You know that.
Yeah.
You know, you're 90 years old like I am, so you know these things. You know, the world has changed.
You're going to keep throwing shade at me? Or Okay,
The
all right,
world
go ahead.
has changed with regard to attitudes toward the gay community and gay rights, right? Revolution. Young people don't even see the issue as a controversy. That wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago. And in 1996, I had to vote on a homophobic bill called the Defense of Marriage Act, which would have denied federal benefits to gay married people. And it was not an easy vote, I'll be honest with you. I would say that in my state at that point, and we are much better on this issue in Vermont than most other states, I would say that a significant majority of the people in Vermont disagreed with me. But I had to go into my heart on this one and say, do I really want to vote for a homophobic bill, a bigoted bill, or should we do the right thing? And I voted against DOMA. Secretary Clinton and Bill Clinton both strongly supported DOMA. So, you know, what happens, and I think, you know, Clinton makes this point, the world has changed. Attitudes have changed. Today, you know, it's not a big deal to be for gay rights. So, you know, I don't think she is homophobic in any sense of the word, no. But I think she is political, and instead of being a leader, you know, today it is easy to be against trade policies because millions of people and workers understand that these trade policies have failed. I was out on a picket line in the early 1990s in opposition to NAFTA. So the question of leadership is, do you have the guts to come out in opposition even when that opposition is not popular? And I think what is fair to say about the Clintons, both of them for that matter, is they are conventional politicians. And, you know, that's not the worst thing in the world. But they look around them and they say, okay, well, you know, we can move on this one. But this one, you know, it's too rough. We can't do that. Leadership is having the guts to be out in front. And I think if you check my record on issue after issue, we were out in front.
So some of your supporters would say, well, if that's the case, and there's a third-party candidate that is much closer to your views, perhaps Green Party, Jill Stein, whoever it might be, why not support the person who's much closer to your views?
Well, because that gets back to the issue I mentioned a moment ago. Look, you're talking to the longest-serving independent in the history of the United States Congress. Right. People don't know it. When I was first elected mayor, you know who I defeated? It wasn't a Republican. It was a 5-term incumbent Democrat. When I ran for Congress the first time, my Republican ended up winning, but you know, it was a very tough fight against a Democrat as well. So I think I know a little bit about third-party politics and running outside of the two-party system. But what you have got to do, and this is where, again, where politics becomes, it's an art, not a science. Nobody has magical answers. And, you know, gets back to Ralph Nader's campaign. I've known Ralph for a million years. Did I agree with a lot of what Ralph Nader had to say? Yeah, I did. Did I want George Bush to become president of the United States? No, I did not. And if you think about the 8 years of Bush and the horror, you know, the terrible, terrible things that happened, whether it was the war in Iraq or so many other things, that's the real world that we live in.
So I'm going to get back to a little bit of speculation here. If you were to lose, do you have someone in your mind for who you would suggest to Hillary Clinton for VP, and Elizabeth Warren or anyone else?
Well, I think on two levels. Number one, on the level of policy, you want somebody who is certainly not from Wall Street. You want somebody who has a history and a track record of standing up for working families and taking on big money interests. That's who you want. And I think not only from a public policy point of view, but from a political point of view, if Hillary Clinton were to win, and if Hillary Clinton were to bring on board a conservative or moderate type Democrat, I think politically that would be a disaster, because if she has not seen the dissatisfaction with establishment politics that's out there now, then she is not a good politician at all.
So if I assume that you had conversations with Senator Warren about endorsing you. Now, some believe, and I'm in that camp, that if she had endorsed you, it might have made a little bit of a difference in Iowa, and a little bit of difference would have meant you won.
It would have helped in Massachusetts, that's for sure.
And exactly right. It would have helped in Massachusetts, where it was a 1.2% difference. Did she ever give you a reason for not endorsing you?
Well, Elizabeth and I are good friends, and we've known each other for many, many years. I knew Elizabeth Warren before she was Elizabeth Warren. She's just a professor at Harvard. Yep. So, you know, I'm not going to convey personal discussions. I don't do that.
All right, fair enough. Now let's go to if you were to win. you recently named 5 people to the platform committee for the convention. And boy, were they progressive. And so, I mean, we
You don't think Cornel West is the typical appointee?
I think we called them the Reservoir Dogs. We called them the Change Gang.
It's a very good group of people.
Right. So now you had Cornel West, Keith Ellison, Bill McKibben, et cetera. So it made me think, Jesus, what would be your cabinet? So do you have names in mind for what would be your cabinet?
Yeah. Well, somebody, Bill McKibben is a fellow Vermonter. He lives in Ripton, Vermont, about 35 miles away from me, and I've known Bill for years. I love the guy. And Bill would play, and given the fact that I am very, very, very concerned, not only about what climate change is doing to this planet, but what pollution is doing. Bill would play a very important role in my cabinet, whether it's head of the EPA or some other position, don't know. Certainly, I happen to believe that if our economy is to go where it has to go, Wall Street cannot continue to exist as it currently is, with a half a dozen banks having just unbelievable economic and political power. They've got to be broken up. People like Robert Reich, actually I think is going to introduce me at a rally in the next few days here in California. Bob was Secretary of Labor, actually, under Bill Clinton. Very, very smart guy, a very, very good economist. I would want Bill to play a very active role. We got Roseanne DeMoro, who is head of the National Nurses United, a strong advocate for healthcare for all, for Medicare healthcare system, Medicare for all healthcare system. Roseanne would play a great role. Look, the truth is, there are many, many great men and women throughout this country who've been active in the labor movement. Larry Cohn comes to mind, who have been active in the environmental community, been active in the women's struggle, the gay struggle, the economic struggle for justice. Rich Trumka, head of the AFL-CIO. He is the best leader of the AFL-CIO that I've seen in my lifetime. I like Rich a whole lot. I would like him to play an active role. So we will bring together the strongest folks that we can find in this country who are involved in standing up for working families, for children, for the elderly, and for the middle class.
Do you? I'm really genuinely curious. Do you know how much that scares the establishment?
Oh, God. Look, one of my joys in this campaign is we have been attacked by the head of Verizon. We've been attacked by the head of General Electric. Been attacked by a major Wall Street guy. We've been attacked by the head of Disney. So I think I'm doing pretty good. We must be doing something right. And there was an article the other day in some paper. Yeah. Wall Street, look, here's the thing about Wall Street. The truth is, for all the right reasons, the vast majority of people, whether they're progressives, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, they understand that Wall Street's greed and illegal behavior has done incalculable harm to this country, and they want a president to stand up to them. And we can do it. We can break up these financial institutions. We can create a new approach where our banks are lending money to small and medium-sized businesses, creating jobs, rather than just living as a world unto itself. So, yes, I am more than aware that corporate America and Wall Street are a little bit nervous about a Bernie Sanders presidency.
Let me ask one more policy question in that regard. So the fossil fuel companies, they basically privatize the gains and socialize the losses, right? So they take all the profits from oil, coal, et cetera, but the things that they put into the environment causes climate change, and we bear all the costs of climate change.
Right. Not only the cost in financial sense, I mean the cost of, what is the cost of the drought in California? I mean, what is that?
Billions upon billions of dollars.
Exactly.
So if you were president, would you put, for example, a climate change tax saying, hey, look, you guys are part of what's causing this problem. So I'm not going to have the people of California pay for it. I'm going to have you pay for it.
Cenk, would I? I have. We've introduced that legislation. It's called the tax on carbon. Yes, of course we would. Look, let me be as clear as I can be. People can criticize me all they want. I'm a member of the U.S. Senate Committee on the Environment. I talk to scientists all of the time. Climate change is a major, major, major crisis for this country and for countries all over the world. And if we do not get our act together in the very short future, the kind of world we're going to leave to your kids and your grandchildren is not going to be a terribly habitable world. So I see this as one of the great crises that we can. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that we kind of know what to do about it. We know, and the goal is you got to tell the carbon, you got to tell the fossil fuel industry, I'm sorry, you may not continue to destroy this planet. Sorry about that, but you can't do it. And we're going to stop you from doing that.
Now, that's why a Trump-Sanders debate would have been really, really interesting, because today he came out with his energy policy, and it was, have at it, Hoss. He's going to let them run amok. He doesn't believe in regulations. He doesn't believe in something he called the Department of Environmental. So you guys have a slightly different take on it, I think.
It is, I don't know what to say. I know he, some while back, concluded not only that climate change was a hoax, okay, that's mostly the Republican position, but it was a hoax perpetrated on the American people by the Chinese. Got that one? I know, it's hard to keep up with that.
Yeah.
Profound thought.
Because they paid off 97% of the world's scientists, I know. So now finally, we had a discussion about how you continue your political revolution if you win. As you pointed out, you get in, you get people power, you pressure Republicans,
right,
not iced but pressure to get real pragmatic change. Okay, now we have to discuss what if you lose. There is this groundswell now. Sometimes I call it a tsunami. There is a political revolution afoot. You talk about it often. Now, that energy should be used for great good, especially if you have the positions that you do, right? So what can you do with that if it turns out you don't become president?
Well, I can't give you a short answer to that because you're asking a very profound question. And nobody has a simple answer to it. But your point, your basic point is well taken. There are millions and millions of people who've kind of rolled up their sleeves, including a lot of working people and a lot of young people who really do want to get involved in the political process and want to make this country the kind of country you and I know it can become. And it would be a terrible shame. It would be just very, very bad if that kind of energy was allowed to dissipate. Now, how you capture that energy, how you bring it forward in a constructive manner, how you maintain the momentum that we have is a complicated issue, because what we're trying to do, in a sense, has not been done. Okay? And I don't have, I'm going to be honest with you, I wish I could tell you I had, well, we're going to do A, B, C, D, and E. Well, first of all, as part of this process, it's not going to be me sitting around there writing all these things. It has to be people themselves, those people. You've raised the question, and together, if we don't win, and certainly we're going to fight to win, that's at the top of my agenda in attempting to answer. But it has to be done with a whole lot of folks.
All right, Senator Bernie Sanders running for president, as you all know. California primary is a couple of weeks away, and we're going to see what happens here. What happens to the political revolution, win or lose. Senator Sanders, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Cenk. Great.
All right, now everybody stay right there. We do have the power panel coming up, and we will discuss Trump's energy policy or lack thereof when we return.